Foundations of Trust Eliza Monroe smoothed the wrinkles from her skirt and checked her watch again. The small waiting room of Northside Community College's career counseling office felt even smaller as the minutes ticked by. She'd been waiting for almost an hour past her scheduled appointment time, but she wouldn't leave. At 32, she was determined to finally finish her degree in hospitality management. Mrs. Monroe, the counselor, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, finally appeared. "I'm sorry for the delay. Please, come in." Eliza followed her into the cramped office, carefully setting down the folder containing her transcripts from 8 years ago, before she'd put her education on hold. "So, you're interested in returning to complete your degree?" The counselor skimmed Eliza's paperwork. "Yes, my husband's business is finally stable enough that I can focus on my own career again." The counselor nodded. "You were only 3 semesters away from completion." "That's promising." Eliza felt a flutter of excitement. Her dream of opening her own small event planning business might finally become reality. She'd already promised Richard she could schedule classes around his business meetings. He relied on her to manage their household affairs and entertain important clients, but surely she could balance it all. Her phone buzzed. Richard's name flashed on the screen. She apologized to the counselor and answered, "Eliza, thank you God you picked up." Richard's voice had that particular tension she recognized all too well. "Johnson just called. He's bringing the Singapore investors over tonight. I need you home preparing everything. But Richard, I'm at the college registering for—" "Please, Eliza, this deal could be the one that puts Monroe Technologies on the map. I've been courting these people for months." She glanced at the course catalog in her hands, at the highlighted evening classes that would fit perfectly around their children's school schedule. "I'll be home in 20 minutes, she said softly. When she arrived home, their modest suburban house was already in chaos. 9-year-old Olivia and 7-year-old Nathan were arguing over the television remote, and a stack of Richard's business documents cluttered the dining table. "Thank goodness," Richard said, kissing her cheek as he rushed past with his phone pressed to his ear. 6 people, something impressive but not showy. "The wine I brought back from Napa would be perfect." She nodded, already mentally calculating how to transform their home into an appropriate venue for international investors with just a few hours' notice. By 7 o'clock, the house gleamed. Eliza had prepared a perfect Northwest-inspired dinner. The children were bathed and coached on appropriate small talk for the brief appearance they would make, and she'd even found time to style her hair and apply makeup. Richard barely noticed, consumed with last-minute preparations for his presentation. "I can't find my backup flash drive," he muttered. "Second drawer of your desk, blue case," Eliza replied without looking up from arranging flowers. "And your good cufflinks are laid out on the dresser." He paused, looking at her with genuine gratitude. "What would I do without you?" The evening went flawlessly. Eliza charmed the investors with her knowledge of Singaporean cuisine while keeping wine glasses filled and conversation flowing. When she noticed one investor's wife looking bored, she subtly steered the talk toward the woman's interest in traditional textiles, information she'd gleaned from a quick pre-dinner internet search. After the guests left, Richard poured them both a glass of the remaining wine. His eyes shined with excitement. "They're going to invest, I'm sure of it. The way Wong nodded when I showed him the prototype." He pulled Eliza into an embrace. "This is it, sweetheart. Everything we've been working toward." "Everything you've been working toward," she corrected gently. He looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "We're a team. Your support makes everything possible." She wanted to mention the college visit, her deferred dreams, but the hope in his eyes stopped her. His technology startup had consumed their lives for 3 years. When he'd been laid off from his corporate job, it was Eliza who'd convinced him to pursue his innovations instead of seeking another position. She'd taken on part-time bookkeeping work to keep them afloat during the lean months, carefully hiding how tired she was juggling work, children, and home. "Of course we're a team," she said instead, leaning into his embrace. "And soon, when everything's secure." "When the company takes off, you can do anything you want," he promised, kissing her forehead. "Take classes, start your business, anything." "I haven't forgotten." She believed him. Despite the postponed dreams and endless sacrifices, she believed in Richard. in them. She just didn't know the price of that belief was about to increase exponentially. Cracks in the facade. 5 years later, Eliza stood in the gleaming kitchen of their new home in Lakewood Heights, the exclusive neighborhood that had once seemed like an impossible dream. The Italian marble countertops reflected the pendant lights. Overhead, as she arranged a cheese board for Richard's impromptu announcement celebration. Monroe Technologies stock jumped 12% today, Olivia, now 14, read from her tablet. Dad's going to be insufferable. Your father worked hard for this success, Eliza reminded her, though she couldn't disagree entirely. Richard had changed with each milestone. The first major investment round, the IPO, the acquisition of their competitor. The man who once brought her coffee in bed now barely noticed when she entered a room. He's been working hard until midnight 3 times this week, Olivia said with the particular skepticism of teenagers. Pretty sure the office doesn't need him there that late. Eliza chose to ignore the implication. How's your science project coming along? Before Olivia could answer, the front door opened. Richard's voice boomed through the house. Where's my beautiful family? We're celebrating tonight. He swept into the kitchen, designer suit still impeccable despite the late hour, eyes bright with triumph. Behind him trailed Vanessa Pierce, the company's marketing director, tall, elegant, and at least a decade younger than Eliza. I brought reinforcements, Richard announced. Vanessa was instrumental in closing the Westfield account. Congratulations, Eliza said, noticing how Vanessa's hand lingered on Richard's arm a moment too long. I didn't realize we were having company. Last-minute decision, Richard said, already reaching for the whiskey. Vanessa knows this fantastic sushi place that delivers. I took the liberty of ordering. Eliza glanced at the food she'd spent the afternoon preparing. I see. Dinner was a study in discomfort. Richard and Vanessa dominated the conversation with inside jokes and technical jargon while Eliza and the children exchanged glances across the table. When Vanessa casually mentioned that little bistro in Chicago they'd discovered during the conference last month, Eliza's stomach tightened. Richard had told her they'd stayed at different hotels. I think I'll turn in early, she announced when Richard suggested opening another bottle of wine. Parent-teacher conferences tomorrow? Richard barely looked up. Sure, honey, don't wait. Up. Vanessa and I need to finalize the presentation for the board meeting. Upstairs, instead of preparing for bed, Eliza sat at her vanity staring at her reflection. When had the subtle lines around her eyes appeared? When had Richard stopped looking at her the way he now looked at Vanessa? On impulse, she reached for Richard's tablet, still connected to their home network. His passwords had always been variations of their anniversary or the children's birthdays, sentimental details that now seemed ironic, given her suspicions. It took only 3 attempts before she was scrolling through his email. What she found shattered the carefully maintained illusion of their marriage. Intimate exchanges with Vanessa dating back 18 months, hotel reservations, a lease agreement for an apartment she knew nothing about. Their Chicago trip hadn't been the beginning. It was simply one chapter in a long-running betrayal. Eliza closed the tablet, her hands surprisingly steady despite the thundering in her chest. She'd suspected, yes, but confirmation brought a strange clarity. The years of deferring her own dreams, of organizing her life around Richard's needs and ambitions, crystallized into a pattern she could no longer ignore. The next morning, she dropped the children at school and drove to the office of Patricia Donovan, reportedly the most feared divorce attorney in the county. The receptionist eyed her expensive handbag, a birthday gift from Richard, and designer clothes. Mrs. Monroe, Ms. Donovan has a 3-week waiting list for initial consultations. Eliza leaned forward. Please tell her that the wife of Richard Monroe, CEO of Monroe Technologies, needs to see her today. I believe she'll make an exception. 30 minutes later, she sat across from Patricia, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s whose gaze missed nothing. Let me guess, Patricia said, closing Eliza's file. He found someone younger, probably at work, and thinks his prenup will protect him. That's correct. And how much did you contribute to building his company? Eliza thought of the thousands of hours hosting investors, managing their household so Richard could focus exclusively on work, the part-time jobs she'd taken during the early years. Everything, she said simply. I handled our entire life while he built his dream. Patricia nodded. The prenup protects his assets from before the marriage. It doesn't account for your contributions to wealth accumulated during the marriage, especially if we can demonstrate the sacrifices you made for his career. I want what's fair, Eliza said, and I want my children protected. Fair? Patricia smiled thinly. In my experience, men like your husband don't understand fair until it hits them in the wallet. She slid a contract across the desk. $50,000 retainer to start, and Mrs. Monroe, from this moment forward, document everything. That night, when Richard called to say he wouldn't be home for dinner, Eliza replied with a cheerfulness she didn't feel. That's fine. The children and I will manage. She hung up and opened the notebook Patricia had given her. At the top of the first page, she wrote the date and time of Richard's call, then added, Claims working late. Background voices suggest restaurant. It was the first entry in what would become a meticulous record of betrayal, evidence for the reckoning to come. The gathering storm? He transferred how much? Gabriela Martinez, Eliza's closest friend and conveniently a paralegal at one of the city's top law firms, stared at the bank statement in disbelief. $2 million to an account in the Caymans last week, Eliza confirmed, sliding another document across the table of the quiet cafe where they met every Wednesday, far from anyone connected to Richard or Monroe Technologies, and he's been liquidating stock options through a shell company. Gabriela whistled softly. Classic pre-divorce asset hiding. Does Patricia know? I sent her everything this morning. Eliza sipped her tea, her expression betraying none of the turmoil she felt. 6 months had passed since discovering Richard's affair, 6 months of playing the oblivious, supportive wife while gathering evidence for the divorce case Patricia was building. How are you managing to get all this information? Eliza allowed herself a small smile. Richard still thinks I'm technologically illiterate. He uses the same passwords for everything and leaves his financial documents in the home office. The man literally labeled a folder personal assets, Eliza no access on our shared cloud storage. Amateur? Gabriela snorted. And he has no idea you're preparing to file? None. He's too caught up with Vanessa and the company's expansion to Japan. He actually asked me to plan their business trip next month. Eliza's voice held a steel edge that hadn't been there a year ago. I booked them the honeymoon suite. Documenting the affair? Gabriela nodded approvingly. Smart. Patricia suggested hiring a private investigator to document their time there. Eliza passed over another folder. These are the names she recommended. While Gabriela reviewed the options, Eliza glanced around the cafe. 6 months ago, such clandestine meetings would have seemed like scenes from someone else's life. Now they were her new normal. What about the children? Gabriela asked, closing the folder. Eliza's expression softened. They know something's wrong. Richard barely sees them anymore, too busy with work and Vanessa. Olivia's figured it out, I think. She's been extra protective of Nathan lately. She paused. I've started looking at smaller houses in good school districts. They'll need stability after everything blows up. You're handling this better than anyone I've ever seen, Gabriela observed. Most clients are emotional wrecks by this stage. Oh, I've had my moments, Eliza admitted. But honestly, there's something empowering about finally taking action after years of putting everyone else first. Later that afternoon, Eliza sat in Patricia's office reviewing their strategy. The conference room walls were covered with timeline charts and financial diagrams mapping Richard's increasingly desperate attempts to hide assets. He's getting sloppy, Patricia noted, highlighting a suspicious transaction. This withdrawal coincides exactly with the down payment on the apartment he bought Vanessa. He's not even trying to cover his tracks anymore. He doesn't think he needs to, Eliza replied. Yesterday, he asked if I'd consider a post-nuptial agreement to protect our family interests given the company's growth. Patricia's eyebrows shot up. Please tell me you acted interested. I did better than that. I suggested we use his family's longtime attorney to draft it, the same man who created our prenup. Richard was thrilled that I was being so reasonable. Brilliant, Patricia said with genuine admiration. Harold Kleinman is ethically obligated to disclose any attempts at fraudulent asset protection. If Richard tries to use him to hide money before your filing, Harold will have to document it, Eliza finished. And since Richard insisted Harold remain our family attorney, there's no attorney-client privilege protecting their communications from me. Patricia shook her head. Your husband seriously underestimates you. Everyone does, Eliza said quietly. That's been my advantage all along. The meeting concluded with a review of their timeline. The private investigator would document Richard and Vanessa's Japan trip next month, providing the final evidence needed. Eliza would file for divorce immediately upon their return, when Richard would be jet-lagged and off balance. As Eliza drove home, she felt a strange sense of calm. The betrayal still hurt. Perhaps it always would, but the powerlessness that had initially overwhelmed her had been replaced with methodical determination. Richard had built his empire believing he stood alone at the top, never acknowledging the foundation Eliza had provided. Soon he would learn the cost of that oversight. That evening, as she prepared dinner, Richard called. "I'll be late again," he said, the familiar excuse requiring no elaboration. "Take your time," Eliza replied, her voice pleasant. "The children and I are having a movie night." "You're the best," Richard said absently, clearly already thinking of other matters. "Don't wait up." "I won't," she promised, and for once it wasn't a lie. She was done waiting for Richard in every sense of the word. Across town, in a sleek downtown apartment Richard had purchased through his shell company, he and Vanessa celebrated their own plans for the future, blissfully unaware of the gathering storm. They opened expensive champagne, toasting to the Japan expansion and the life they planned after Richard finally left his increasingly distant wife. "To us," Vanessa said, clinking her glass against his. "And to finally having everything we deserve." "Everything we deserve," Richard echoed. The irony of his words lost on him as Eliza's investigator photographed them through the window from the building across the street. Day of reckoning. The courtroom's oak-paneled walls seemed to close in as Richard Monroe shifted uncomfortably in his expensive suit. Across the aisle, Eliza sat composed beside Patricia Donovan, both women reviewing documents with focused calm that contrasted sharply with Richard's growing agitation. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to his attorney. Bradley Weiss, a corporate lawyer who specialized in mergers and acquisitions, not family law. "The prenup is ironclad. She gets the house, a generous monthly allowance, and I maintain primary custody of the children during the school year since I can provide better stability with my resources." Bradley looked less certain. "Mr. Monroe, I've advised you repeatedly to retain a specialist in family law, and these allegations about hidden assets—" "Baseless," Richard interrupted. "She's bitter about Vanessa, that's all. Eliza's never understood business. She thinks every corporate restructuring is some conspiracy to deprive her." At the back of the courtroom, Vanessa Pierce sat with perfect posture, her presence a calculated statement. Richard had insisted she attend, believing it demonstrated their relationship wasn't just some tawdry affair, but a genuine partnership, one worth dismantling his family for. Judge Harriet Winters entered, her reputation for fairness and meticulous attention to detail preceding her. At 68, she'd seen every divorce tactic imaginable during her 3 decades on the bench. The room stood as she took her seat, surveying the parties with practiced neutrality. "Monroe versus Monroe," she announced, reviewing the file before her. "I've read all submissions from both parties. Ms. Donovan, you've requested to present additional evidence before we discuss settlement proposals?" "Yes, Your Honor," Patricia replied, rising with a thick binder. "We've prepared documentation regarding undisclosed assets and evidence of Mr. Monroe's systematic efforts to diminish Mrs. Monroe's marital contributions." Richard snorted audibly, earning a sharp glance from Judge Winters. "Mr. Monroe, you'll have your opportunity to respond," she warned. "Ms. Donovan, proceed." What followed was a devastating 3-hour presentation chronicling not only Richard's financial deceptions, but the history of Eliza's contributions to his success. Patricia called the administrative assistant who had worked at Monroe Technologies from its beginning, who testified about Eliza's role hosting critical investors when the company couldn't afford proper offices. She presented emails from Richard himself, written during the early years, acknowledging that Eliza's connections and social skills had secured their first major contract. Financial forensics revealed Richard's hidden accounts and the apartment purchased for Vanessa. Most damning was evidence that Richard had begun transferring company ownership shares to shell corporations. 2 days after Eliza's meeting with Patricia, timing that suggested corporate espionage, Your Honor, Patricia concluded. Mrs. Monroe didn't just support her husband's business. Evidence shows she was instrumental in its formation and growth while sacrificing her own career ambitions. The prenuptial agreement Mr. Monroe keeps referencing was signed when neither party had significant assets and doesn't address wealth accumulated through joint efforts during marriage. Throughout the presentation, Richard's expression had shifted from dismissive to concerned to openly alarmed. When Judge Winters called a brief recess, he huddled with Bradley, their heated whispers carrying across the now empty courtroom. How did she get all this? The Cayman accounts weren't even in my name. I told you we should have settled, Bradley hissed. Judge Winters despises hidden assets cases, especially when children are involved. When proceedings resumed, Richard's attorney attempted damage control, arguing that Eliza's contributions, while appreciated, were standard spousal support and that her access to financial records constituted invasion of privacy. Judge Winters removed her glasses. Mr. Weiss, are you suggesting that Mrs. Monroe, who testified she managed your client's household finances for 15 years, had no right to view accounts bearing her name as co-owner? No, Your Honor, and the apartment purchased for Ms. Pierce using funds from the children's education accounts was Mrs. Monroe, invading privacy by noticing her. Children's future was being spent on her husband's mistress? The courtroom fell silent. Even Vanessa, who had maintained her composure throughout, paled visibly. After hearing closing arguments, Judge Winters delivered her ruling. With measured precision, this court finds the prenuptial agreement valid regarding premarital assets but inapplicable to wealth generated during the marriage through demonstrated joint effort. Evidence clearly establishes that Monroe Technologies, while bearing Mr. Monroe's name, was built with significant contributions from Mrs. Monroe, she continued, each word falling like a hammer. The court awards Mrs. Monroe the family residence, primary custody of the children, and 50% ownership of Monroe Technologies, recognizing her as an unofficial co-founder whose contributions have never been properly acknowledged. Richard stood abruptly. This is outrageous. You can't give her half my company. Judge Winters fixed him with a stare that silenced him immediately. Mr. Monroe, evidence suggests you've already diverted company assets for personal use, potentially constituting corporate fraud. This ruling is generous compared to what might result from a criminal investigation, which I have the authority to recommend. Richard sank back into his seat as Judge Winters concluded. Furthermore, given Mr. Monroe's demonstrated financial dishonesty, the court appoints an independent trustee to oversee the children's accounts until they reach majority age. As the judge departed, the courtroom erupted in hushed conversations. Across the aisle, Eliza remained seated, hands folded in her lap. Her expression not triumphant but relieved, as though a great weight had finally been lifted. When she finally stood to leave, her gaze briefly met Richard's. For a moment, recognition flickered across his face, not of the compliant wife he'd taken for granted, but of a woman whose strength and intelligence he had fatally underestimated. Behind him, Vanessa had already slipped out the courtroom door, her absence speaking volumes about the nature of commitment built on betrayal. Renaissance. The autumn sunlight filtered through the windows of Eliza's new office, casting a warm glow across architectural drawings spread across her desk. 18 months after the divorce, Monroe & Associates Event Design occupied the renovated carriage house behind her home, a space once intended as Richard's man cave, now transformed into headquarters for her rapidly growing business. A gentle knock interrupted her concentration. "The Jacobson wedding clients are here," announced Teresa, her assistant and fellow divorcee whom Eliza had hired after meeting at a support group. "Send them in," Eliza replied, smoothing her hair. At 40, she had stopped coloring the silver strands that now elegantly streaked her dark hair, a visual reminder of hard-won wisdom she no longer wished to conceal. The meeting went brilliantly, with the Jacobsons enthusiastically approving her venue recommendations. As Teresa showed them out, Eliza checked her watch. She still had time before meeting Olivia and Nathan for dinner. Her children, now 16 and 14, split their time between her home and Richard's considerably downsized condominium, an arrangement that had proven surprisingly stable. Richard himself had undergone an unexpected transformation after the divorce. The humbling experience of losing half his company and the subsequent departure of Vanessa, who left shortly after discovering his diminished financial situation, had forced a reckoning. While their relationship remained strictly co-parental, Eliza acknowledged that Richard had become a more present father, coaching Nathan's soccer team and never missing Olivia's debate competitions. Monroe Technologies continued to thrive under shared ownership, with Eliza serving on the board but delegating day-to-day involvement to a trusted proxy. Her settlement had provided financial security, but it was building her own business that had restored her sense of purpose. As she gathered her materials, her phone chimed with a message from Marcus Winters, the landscape architect she'd collaborated with on several events. "Designs for the Sullivan Anniversary Garden look amazing. Free for coffee tomorrow to discuss?" Eliza smiled, remembering their first meeting a year ago. She'd hired Marcus to create temporary gardens for an elaborate spring wedding, impressed by his portfolio featuring sustainable designs. What began as professional respect had gradually evolved into friendship, and recently something more. Unlike Richard, whose ambition burned with consuming intensity, Marcus approached life and work with balanced passion. At 45, he had built his reputation steadily over 2 decades, finding success without sacrificing his humanity in the process. Their relationship had developed with careful deliberation on both sides. Eliza, wary of rushing into another commitment, and Marcus, a widower still honoring his late wife's memory, moved forward with honest communication about their fears and expectations. She replied to his message, "Coffee sounds perfect. Looking forward to it." Later that evening, after dinner with the children, Eliza stood in her garden watching the sunset. Nathan had proudly shown off his improved math grades, while Olivia shared exciting news about college campus visits. Their resilience through the divorce had astonished her, though the family therapist had explained that children often adapt better to peaceful separation than conflicted togetherness. The sound of tires on gravel announced Marcus's arrival. He'd mentioned possibly stopping by after his meeting in the neighborhood, but made it clear there was no pressure to receive him if she was tired. "The Sullivan plans turned out beautifully," he said after greeting her with a warm embrace. They sat on the porch swing, his weathered hands gently holding the design portfolio. "I incorporated those lighting elements you suggested. They'll create perfect ambiance for the dinner." As he walked her through the designs, Eliza found herself studying his face, the laugh lines around his eyes, the flecks of gray in his beard, the attentive way he listened to her feedback. There was nothing flashy about Marcus Winters, nothing that would have caught the younger Eliza's eye when she dreamed of dramatic romance. Instead, he offered something far more valuable: partnership between equals, built on mutual respect and genuine interest in her thoughts, dreams, and ambitions. "What?" he asked, noticing her contemplative gaze. "Just thinking about unexpected journeys," she replied. "5 years ago, I couldn't have imagined this life." He nodded, understanding without requiring elaboration. "Regrets? About the divorce?" "None." She leaned slightly against his shoulder. "About the years before? Sometimes I wish I'd recognized my own worth sooner." "You were finding your strength," Marcus said. "Some people never do." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled around them. Tomorrow would bring client meetings, design decisions, and the ordinary business of rebuilding a life. But tonight, in this moment of quiet companionship, Eliza Munro realized she had gained something precious from the painful dissolution of her marriage, the knowledge that real love, wasn't about sacrifice or submission, but about finding someone who saw your light and wanted to see it shine brighter. "Stay for a while?" she asked. "As long as you'd like," he answered, and in the simplicity of those words lay a profound truth. The best relationships weren't built on grand gestures or passionate declarations, but on the quiet certainty of showing up, day after day, for someone whose happiness mattered as much as your own. As they talked into the evening, planning collaborations and sharing stories, Eliza reflected that perhaps this was the most important lesson of her journey, that sometimes losing what you thought you wanted opens the door to discovering what you truly need.